the royal poison plot that ended in a boiling cauldron. In response to a single incident of alleged poisoning, the English Parliament of 1531 passed an extraordinary act, retroactively defining the crime as high treason. The statute stipulated a punishment as novel as the law itself: death by being boiled alive. The first individual subjected to this sentence was a cook named Richard Roose, whose case implicated the highest levels of the Tudor court. In the latter days of February 1531, the King of England entered Parliament. The session fell silent as Henry VIII took his place, the Assembly's attention fixed upon the singular authority of the Tudor monarch. His purpose was not to debate, but to inform and direct. A grave offense had been committed, one which, in the king's highest, stated view, threatened the very fabric of the realm, and demanded a legislative response of unparalleled severity. The matter concerned a recent event in the household of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher, but the king's address framed the incident as a symptom of a deeper disorder that required a new and terrible remedy. He spoke of poison as a weapon of cowards and conspirators, an oave-cast weapon, Italianate method unsuited to the character of England. Such an act, he argued, was more than simple murder. It was an assault on trust and hierarchy, an invisible treason that could dismantle a great house or a kingdom from within. It was declared that any such attempt, particularly against a high-ranking subject of the crown, constituted a direct challenge to the king's peace. The stability of the nation, he implied, was contingent on the security of its leading figures, and this security had been breached. The king was resolute that existing laws were insufficient to deter this specific form of malice. Following the address, a bill was introduced, and Act for Poisoning. This piece of legislation was remarkable in its scope and specificity. It formally expanded the definition of high treason to include murder committed by means of poison. The bill did not propose a conventional punishment. Instead, it stipulated a penalty that had no recent precedent in English law for a common criminal. The convicted poisoner was to suffer death by being boiled alive in water. This method was presented as a symmetrical justice, a public spectacle designed to answer the hidden nature of the crime with a visible and protracted process of annihilation. The most formidable aspect of the act was its retroactive power. The law was cruel, written not only for the future, but also for the past, specifically to address the incident that had prompted its creation. It effectively functioned as a bill of attainder, a legislative judgment that bypassed the courts entirely. There would be no indictment by a grand jury, no trial by a jury of one's peers, no opportunity for the accused to offer a defense before a judge. The Parliament, at the direction of the king, was to serve as both judge and jury. The legislation condemned a cook from Rochester, a man named Richard Roose, also known as Richard Cook. His guilt was assumed, and his fate was sealed within the life disappointed. Text of the statute, before it was even formally passed into law, a clear demonstration of the Crown's ability to manipulate Parliament to achieve its ends, regardless of established legal tradition. The precedent set was ominous. The law could be reshaped and reapplied at the king's will, a tool not only for justice, but for the removal of any person deemed an obstacle. The grounds for the king's new law were laid 10 days prior, on the 18th day of February, 1531. The location was the palace of the Bishop of Rochester at Lambeth March, a residence known for the piety and charitable works of its master, John Fisher. The bishop's household was accustomed to offering sustenance not only to its staff and retainers, but also to the local poor who came to the gates seeking aid. It was an ordinary day, and the kitchens were occupied with the preparation of meals, including a large quantity of pottage, a staple food for a large and varied gathering. The sequence of events was later recorded in solid weather. The text of the Act of Parliament itself. According to that document, a cook in the bishop's service, identified as Richard Roose of Rochester, also called Richard Cook, approached a vessel containing yeast, or barm, that was intended for use in the day's cooking. He allegedly introduced a white powder into the mixture. The contaminated yeast was subsequently used by the kitchen staff, unaware of its, quote, adulteration, to prepare the common pot of pottage for the midday meal. The food was distributed among the household and its guests. The effects were not immediate, but when they began, they were swift and violent. A sudden malady swept through those who had eaten from the pot. Nearly 20 individuals were overcome with severe sickness, their bodies racked with a painful and debilitating affliction that turned the Bishop's Hall of Charity into a scene of chaos and distress. The large number of afflicted, around 17 members of tactics, the bishop's company, created widespread panic within the palace walls. 2 of those who ate the pottage did not survive. One was a gentleman of the household, Bennet Curwen. The other was a poor widow named Alice Trippitt, who had been present that day, specifically, to receive the charity for which Bishop John Fisher was known. The poison made no distinction between class or status, claiming one from within the bishop's immediate circle and one from among the vulnerable people he sought to serve. The intended target, however, was believed to be the Bishop of Rochester himself. John Fisher was a figure of immense political and religious significance in England, one of the most respected Catholic scholars in Europe, and a staunch defender of the Queen, Catherine of Aragon. Yet, on this particular day, he consumed none of the fatal pottage. It was reported that the bishop was fasting and took very little food, a practice of religious discipline that, in this instance, inadvertently saved his life. He remained unharmed while members of his household, including those who depended on his generosity for their survival, suffered the consequences of the attack meant for him. The plot had failed in its primary objective, but succeeded in causing death and disorder, leaving an indelible stain on the bishop's household. Amid the turmoil that consumed the Bishop of Rochester's palace at Lambeth March, as the sick writhed and the dead were counted, suspicion consolidated upon a single individual. In the disarray of the kitchen, one man was unaccounted for: the cook, Richard Roose. As the gravity of the incident became clear, and attention turned from the victims to the perpetrator, it was discovered that Roose had disappeared. His absence from the scene of the calamity was immediate and total. The flight of Richard Cook was taken as a confession. The act of running from the chaos he had allegedly caused was interpreted by the authorities as definitive proof of his culpability. An immediate pursuit was organized, reportedly led by the bishop's own brother, Richard Fisher, who acted with haste to apprehend the fugitive. The search was not a prolonged one. Roose was captured quickly, his attempt to escape the vicinity of London proving futile. His capture concluded the first frantic phase of the investigation. Upon his apprehension, Richard Roose was not delivered to a common prison. His destination was the Tower of London. By direct command, he was incarcerated within the walls of the ancient fortress, a place reserved for prisoners of the state. This singular decision elevated the crime from a domestic homicide to a matter of national security. The involvement of Muncie Bryan Johnson. Boston Johnson Jeffrey. The Tower signaled that the Crown now viewed the poisoning in the Bishop of Rochester's household as an offense against the king himself, and the accused would be dealt with accordingly. The news of the attempt on John Fisher's life, followed by the cook's BDP flight and subsequent imprisonment in the Tower of London, sent a shockwave through the city and the court. A latent fear of assassination, common in the corridors of power across Europe, became a palpable and present anxiety within the noble houses of Tudor England. The incident at Lambeth March was a catalyst, transforming abstract political tensions into a tangible threat that could manifest in the most endless crime. Ordinary of settings, the dinner table. The great households of London became gripped by a paranoia over food preparation, and the loyalty of domestic servants was suddenly a subject of intense scrutiny. This wave of fear reached the king's own royal court, where the latter political stakes were the highest, and the threat of a well-placed poison was no longer a subject of distant history, but an urgent concern. Within the stone confines of the Tower of London, The case of Richard Roose proceeded according to a different set of rules. Here, the objective was not to prepare for a public trial, but to extract a truth that satisfied the state. The cook from Rochester was now a prisoner under the direct authority of the King's Council, and the primary goal of his incarceration, was interrogation. The Crown sought answers, not to the question of if Roose had poisoned the pottage. His flight had settled that matter in the official view. But why? And at whose behest? The fear of a wider conspiracy, a hidden network of Protestants or political enemies aiming to destabilize the realm by eliminating key figures like John Fisher, drove the inquiry. To uncover this suspected plot, the interrogators were authorized to employ methods beyond simple questioning. It was reported that Richard Roose was subjected to the difference of the good faith. In the final testimonies, Richard Roose was casting a set of evil scar horse. He was reported that Richard Roose was subjected to the king ash rack, an instrument of persuasion notorious throughout Europe. The device was a simple wooden frame, but its function was severe. The prisoner was bound at the wrists and ankles to rollers at opposite ends of the structure. As the interrogation progressed, the rollers would be turned, incrementally pulling the limbs in opposing directions and placing intolerable strain on the shoulders, hips, and spine. Its application was a methodical and controlled process, designed to break the will of the subject and compel a confession. Under this duress, the resistance of Richard Roose collapsed. He provided his interrogators with a statement. He admitted that he had, in fact, placed a white powder in the vessel of yeast in the kitchen at Lambeth March. The confession affirmed the central physical act of which he was accused. He acknowledged that he had introduced a foreign substance, what he termed a certain venom or poison, into the food supply of Mathematis, the Bishop of Rochester's household. However, the confession was qualified with a crucial and desperate caveat. Roose insisted that his act was, quote, not one of murder or political assassination, but of a misguided and catastrophic joke. He maintained that he did not know the efficiency, powder, to be a deadly poison. He claimed to have believed it was a simple laxative, a purgative, that would cause temporary illness and discomfort to those who consumed the pottage, but would ultimately do no lasting harm. He had intended, he stated, only to create some minor gastric distress among the household. The fatal outcome, he asserted, was entirely unintended. Throughout the ordeal, interrogators pressed him for the names of his accomplices. They sought to uncover the larger plot they were convinced lay behind the attempt on PSC, the life of Bishop John Fisher. But on this point, Richard Roose was unwavering. He gave over no names. He implicated no one else in his actions, whether from the camp of Anne Boleyn, from the ranks of Protestants, or from any other faction at court. He maintained that he had acted entirely alone, driven by a foolish impulse rather than a conspiratorial design. The interrogation, therefore, ended in ambiguity. A confession had been secured, but it was not the one the Crown had been looking for. The statement confirmed the hand of the cook, but pointed to no higher authority, leaving the official narrative with a lone, foolish perpetrator and 2 unexplained deaths. The confession, extracted from Richard Roose in the Tower of London, provided the Crown with a culprit, but the narrative of a solitary cook perpetrating a lethal joke failed to quell the unease surrounding the affair. In the politically steamed and charged atmosphere of the Tudor court, where every event was scrutinized for hidden meanings and secret allegiances, the official explanation seemed incomplete. The speed and finality of the state's response, condemning a man without trial, based on a confession obtained under duress, gave rise to a competing interpretation, one that circulated in whispers and was recorded in the careful dispatches of foreign observers. No observer was more astute or better placed than Eustace Chapuz, the imperial ambassador to England. Serving the Holy Roman Emperor, who was the nephew of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Chapuz had a vested interest in the political currents that threatened his master's aunt and her supporters. His correspondence provided a detailed alternative record of the events, one that looked beyond the cook in the kitchen to the powers seated on and near the throne. In his reports, Chapelese documented a deep-seated skepticism toward the official story, noting suspicions. The poisoning was not the act of a single man, but an organized plot originating from within the king's own circle. The context for this suspicion was the great and overriding political crisis of the reign. The king's desperate effort to secure an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne Boleyn. Bishop John Fisher stood as the most formidable obstacle to the king's will. As a scholar of European renown and a man of unbending principle, he was the primary champion of Queen Catherine's cause in England. He had argued her case with theological rigor and legal force, publicly defying the king and defending the indissolubility of the marriage and the supreme authority of the Pope. His opposition was not merely theoretical. It was a perfect tact. And of all the other indecision. Direct and powerful challenge to Henry VIII's ambition to break with the Catholic Church and declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England. To the ascended faction of Anne Boleyn, John Fisher was a bitter and hated enemy. Eustace Chapuis documented this animosity in his dispatches, noting that Anne Boleyn and her family made no secret of their desire to see the Bishop of Rochester silenced. He recorded rumors that Anne had openly wished for Fisher's death. From this perspective, the attempt on the bishop's forest life was not a random act of malice, but a targeted political assassination. The true target was not just the man, but the cause he represented. The failure of the plot, Fisher's survival, did not negate its underlying motive. The actions of the king self-fueled these suspicions. The swift creation of a new law, the denial of a public trial for Richard Roose, and the prescription of a uniquely horrific execution could be seen as more than a simple desire for justice. An open trial would have arguable problems to race of crime, that they see a central priestine, indebted by the death of the sea, and dance off the brave slaves as manner for justice. Meant public testimony. Richard Roose, even if he were the sole perpetrator, would have been given a platform to speak. A wider conspiracy, if one existed, could have been exposed. By condemning the cook through an act of parliament, Henry VIII ensured that the investigation went no further. The king's decisive intervention, framed as a righteous response to a heinous crime, effectively sealed the matter, preventing any inconvenient truths from emerging in a court of law. The ominous precedent set by the statute, that the law could be wielded as an absolute instrument of the king's will, was now being viewed as the very mechanism for a potential cover-up, protecting the powerful by making a spectacular and definitive example of the powerless. On the 5th day of April, 1531, the sentence legislated by Parliament was carried out. The location chosen was Smithfield, a wide open space on the outskirts of London, already etched into the public consciousness as a site of judgment. For generations, it had been a place of markets and tournaments, but also a ground for executions, particularly for heretics condemned to the fire. On this day, a different kind of pyre was prepared. A large iron cauldron, filled with water, was set over a fire built to bring it to a rolling boil. Gathered, drawn by the novelty and severity of the punishment decreed by the king, they came from across London to witness the whole light enactment of the new law, a form of justice unseen in living memory. Richard Roose was brought from the Tower of London to the execution ground. He was the subject of the day's spectacle, the man for whom the law had been written and Boleyn beast. He was held back in the cast of 7 years past bed. He was the subject of the day's spectacle, the man for whom the law had been written and not ceased to work through, for whom this apparatus had been constructed. There was no final appeal and no possibility of mercy. His fate had been determined weeks earlier in the chambers of Parliament. He was now simply a body to be disposed of according to the precise letter of the statute. The proceedings were methodical, devoid of the religious ceremony that sometimes accompanied the execution of those condemned for heresy. This was a secular act of state power, a demonstration of the consequences of a newly defined treason. Accounts of the event, most notably the record in the Chronicle of the Grey Friars, describe the mechanics of the execution. Richard Roose was bound securely in chains. A gibbet-like structure with a pulley system was erected over the cauldron, designed to control the immersion. Once the public history was made up of the condemned individuals of every possible plant, and 5 of the old city-style province. Water had reached the required temperature. The process began. Rose was hoisted by the chains and then lowered into the boiling liquid. The chronicler records that he was not submerged and held there, but was instead lowered in and out of the water multiple times. One contemporary account states that as he was immersed, he roared mighty loud. The public nature of the execution meant his response was not a private agony, but a communal spectacle. The sounds and sight of the procedure had a documented effect on the assembled crowd. The same account notes that several women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw and were carried away half dead. Yet, this distress was not universal. The account continues, stating, "Other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work." The reaction of the record crowd was as much a part of the event as the execution itself, a reflection of the varied sensibilities of the Tudor press. Public, for whom such spectacles were a recurring feature of civic life. The process was repeated until Richard Roose was dead. The law had been fulfilled. The cook from Rochester had been publicly boiled, a punishment that some observers noted was a grim and symbolic reflection of his alleged crime, an offense committed in a kitchen, now answered in a cauldron. With his death, the presence of the books and kids are famed in sets of the praise of courage on the death. Official investigation into the poisoning at Lambeth March was concluded. The king's swift and terrible justice had been served, and any lingering questions about a wider conspiracy were rendered moot by the finality of the execution at Smithfield. The story of Richard Roose is read hardy, a somber reminder of how quickly the gears of state can turn to crush an individual. We began with the creation of Condo Washington, an extraordinary law, and we end with its terrible physical application. Whether a malicious assassin or a foolish prankster, a cook from Rochester became the first and final object of a punishment as unique as it was horrifying. His fate sealed, not by a jury, but by a king's will written into statute. We appreciate you joining us for this account on Content Channel. The case leaves us with a stark ambiguity. Richard Roose confessed under torture that he only intended a prank, yet the Crown treated his act as high treason. Based on the political climate and the events that followed, do you believe Rose's claim of a misguided brass joke, or was the swift and brutal punishment covering a deeper conspiracy? Share your analysis in the comments below. Thank you for your time and consideration. We'll see you in the next chronicle, where we'll discover how Bishop John Fisher, who survived the poison, ultimately met his own end at the hands of the very king he once served.